I moved into my new apartment last summer, looking for a fresh start. It wasn't much. A one-bedroom unit in an old, run-down building on the edge of town. The rent was cheap and the landlord didn't ask too many questions, which worked for me. The building had seen better days. The wallpaper in the hallways was peeling and the air always seemed damp. But it was quiet. That's all I really wanted. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, settled into my routine, and started getting to know my surroundings. There weren't many tenants in the building, at least not that I could tell. Most of the doors in the hallway were closed, with no signs of activity. But then I met my neighbor. His name was Mr. Grayson, and he lived in the unit directly across from mine. I was carrying groceries back to my apartment one evening when he stepped out of his door. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with a thin frame and sunken eyes that always seemed to be studying you. "A new tenant?" he said with a friendly smile. I nodded. "Yeah, I just moved in a few days ago." He extended a hand. "Grayson, been here for years. Welcome to the building." I shook his hand, noticing how cold and clammy it felt. He started asking me questions. What I did for work, where I was from, and if I lived alone. At first, I thought he was just being polite, but his questions felt off, like he was praying. Still, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just lonely. Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to knock," he said, before retreating back into his apartment. I nodded and went inside, feeling a little uneasy, but brushing it off. A week passed without incident, but then the noises started. Late at night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I'd hear faint sounds coming from Grayson's apartment. At first, it was just the occasional thud or scrape, which I figured was normal for an old building. But as the nights went on, the noises became stranger. I'd hear muffled footsteps pacing back and forth, whispering voices, and what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. One night, I swore I heard something tapping against the shared wall between our units. It was faint but rhythmic, like someone was deliberately knocking. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the building settling, or maybe even my imagination. But then I started finding the gifts. The first one appeared about 2 weeks after I moved in. It was a keychain, one that I thought I'd lost during the move. I found it sitting neatly on my welcome mat when I left for work one morning. At first I was relieved. I figured someone in the building must have found it and left it for me. I didn't think much of it until the second gift showed up. This time it was an old photograph of mine. It was a picture of me and a few friends from college, one I distinctly remembered packing away in a box that was still sealed in my closet. The photo was placed in the exact same spot on my welcome mat. That's when I started to feel uneasy. How would anyone have gotten into my apartment to take that photo? I double-checked my locks and even pushed a chair against the door that night, just in case. But the gifts kept coming. A single sock that had gone missing from my laundry, a pen I'd left on my desk, random, mundane objects from inside my apartment, all appearing outside my door. By the fourth or fifth time, I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was entering my apartment while I was away. One night, after another day of hearing the strange noises from Grayson's unit, I decided to confront him. I'd had enough. I knocked on his door, and after a few moments, he answered. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if he'd been expecting me. "Can I help you?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. I hesitated. I've been hearing noises coming from your apartment late at night, and I've been finding things outside my door, things from inside my apartment. Do you know anything about that?" Grayson's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "Noises? This old building makes all kinds of sounds. As for the things outside your door, maybe you're just forgetful. Happens to the best of us." His tone was dismissive, almost mocking. I felt a surge of anger, but also a deep, primal fear. There was something about him that felt wrong. I mumbled an apology and went back to my apartment, but I didn't sleep that night. A few days later, the noises were louder than ever. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor, followed by faint whispering. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I waited for Grayson to leave, and when I saw him walk out of the building, I made my move. I'd seen the building manager use a spare key to access a tenant's unit once before. It wasn't hard to find where he kept it. My hands shook as I unlocked Grayson's door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a mix of dampness and decay. The apartment was dark, with heavy curtains blocking out any sunlight. The walls were covered in photographs, and as I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. They were all pictures of me. Some were taken through my window, others while I was out running errands, and a few of me sleeping. On a table in the corner was a collection of objects, all the things that had gone missing from my apartment. My keychain, the photograph, the sock, and dozens of other items I hadn't even realized were missing. But the worst part was the crawl space. In the corner of the room was a small, hidden door that had been left slightly ajar. When I opened it, I saw a narrow passage that connected to the wall behind my apartment. It was lined with scuff marks and empty food wrappers, evidence that someone had been crawling through it regularly. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, I heard the sound of the front door opening. Grayson was back. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly ducked into the crawl space, trying to stay as quiet as possible. From my hiding spot, I could hear Grayson moving around the apartment, humming to himself. Then, his voice broke the silence. "I know you're here," he said, his tone calm and almost playful. "You shouldn't have come in without knocking." My blood ran cold. He was walking closer to the crawl space. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the passage. Just as his shadow loomed over the entrance, I pushed my way through the crawl space, back into my apartment. I slammed the hidden door shut and barricaded it with a dresser. I didn't wait. I grabbed my essentials and left the apartment that night, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I've never gone back. I reported what I found to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. By the time they checked Grayson's apartment, it was empty. He was gone. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the look in his eyes when I confronted him, the way his smile didn't quite reach his face, and I wonder if he's still out there, watching me, or if he's found someone new to welcome to the building. I moved into my new apartment last spring, thrilled about the opportunity to finally live alone. The neighborhood was quiet, tucked away on a tree-lined street, and my second-floor apartment had a perfect view of the block. It seemed like an ideal place to start fresh. Directly across from me was an old house with wide windows, which often had their curtains drawn. At night, though, the curtains would part slightly, and I would occasionally catch a glimpse of the man who lived there. He appeared to be middle-aged, always dressed in an undershirt, and he seemed harmless enough. But as the weeks passed, I began noticing something strange. Every time I glanced out my window late at night, he was standing there, staring directly at my apartment. At first, I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just looking outside to check the weather, or maybe he had insomnia and found himself drawn to the window. But it happened so frequently that it became impossible to ignore. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off, telling myself that as long as he stayed on his side of the street, it wasn't my problem. One night, however, something changed. I had just turned off the lights and climbed into bed when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from my bedroom window. I froze. My bedroom was on the second floor, and there was no balcony or tree nearby that someone could use to reach it. The logical part of me tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bird or a branch brushing against the glass. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the empty street below and the dark silhouette of the house across from me. The next morning, I checked the area below my window, but there was nothing unusual. No fallen branches, no signs of anyone having been there. Still, the sound had been so distinct, so deliberate, that I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left behind. A few days later, I noticed something else. Every time I walked past my window at night, the man across the street was there, standing behind his curtains, staring. It felt like his eyes were following me, tracking my every move. I started keeping my own curtains closed, hoping that would give me some sense of privacy. But it didn't stop the tapping. It began happening more frequently, always late at night. The faint, rhythmic sound on my window became impossible to ignore. I started losing sleep, lying awake for hours, straining to hear any other noises. My paranoia grew with each passing night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Desperate for answers, I decided to install a security camera in my bedroom. I placed it so it faced the window, hoping it would capture whatever was causing the tapping. That night, I went to bed early, determined to finally figure out what was going on. The next morning, I reviewed the footage with a sinking feeling in my stomach. At first, there was nothing unusual. Hours passed with no activity, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, around 3 a.m., the tapping started. My heart raced as I watched the screen, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A figure was standing outside my window. It was the man from across the street. He was perched precariously on the narrow ledge beneath my window, tapping on the glass with his fingers. The way he stood there, perfectly balanced, was unnatural, almost inhuman. And then, as if sensing the camera, he slowly turned his head to look directly at it. His face was pale and expressionless. But his eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with something that could only be described as malice. I called the police immediately, showing them the footage as proof. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but their response didn't fill me with much confidence. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept every light in my apartment on, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I decided to confront the man. I waited until I saw him outside, trimming the hedges in front of his house. He looked up as I approached, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but detached. I struggled to keep my voice steady. "I've noticed you watching me, and last night my security camera caught you outside my window. What are you doing?" His smile didn't waver. "I think you've got me confused with someone else. I don't leave my house at night." I wanted to press further, but there was something about the way he looked at me, calm, almost amused, that made me feel like I was the one in the wrong. I walked away, my hands trembling with frustration and fear. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It sounded angry, almost frantic. I didn't dare look outside. Instead, I locked myself in the bathroom, clutching my phone, and waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, I checked the footage from my camera, dreading what I might see. This time, the man wasn't alone. There were two figures standing outside my window. One was him, and the other I couldn't make out. It was taller, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head seemed to tilt at an odd angle, as if it were studying me through the glass. They stood there together for hours, motionless, before finally disappearing just as dawn broke. I packed my things that day and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, and I didn't look back. I never even went to the police to show them the new footage. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Even now, in my new apartment, miles away, I still sleep with the curtains closed. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint tapping on the window, and I wonder if they've found me again. A few years ago, my family moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a charming house with a big backyard and friendly neighbors, except for one thing: the house next door. From the moment we arrived, I noticed something was off. The house was old and abandoned. Its windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown. The realtor brushed it off, saying it had been empty for decades. But when our neighbor Mrs. Carlson stopped by to welcome us, her words stuck with me. "Stay away from that house," she warned. "Nothing good ever comes from poking around there." At first, we thought it was just an old urban legend. But it didn't take long for the strange events to begin. The first time I noticed something odd was late at night. I was lying in bed when I heard laughter, faint and childlike, coming from outside. I got up and looked out my window, which faced the abandoned house, but I didn't see anything. I figured it must have been my imagination. The next night, the laughter came again, only louder. This time, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing in the yard. My little sister Ellie also started noticing things. One morning, she casually mentioned, "There's a light in the upstairs window." My mom frowned. "Ellie, the windows are boarded up." Ellie just shrugged. "I saw it." That night, I stayed up late staring at the house. And sure enough, around midnight, a faint light flickered in one of the upstairs windows. Over the next week, the activity escalated. Footsteps became a nightly occurrence. The laughter grew louder, and sometimes I swore I heard whispers coming from the direction of the house, though I couldn't make out the words. Ellie started having nightmares about someone knocking on her bedroom wall. Finally, my dad decided to ask the neighbors about the house. Most of them avoided the topic, but Mrs. Carlson eventually shared the story. Years ago, a family lived there, a couple and their 2 kids. One day, they just vanished, left everything behind. No one knows why. Every family that's moved in since hasn't stayed long. They all say the same thing: the house isn't empty. My dad didn't believe in ghosts, but he decided to investigate. Late one night, after another round of laughter and footsteps, he grabbed a flashlight and headed next door. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The front door was unlocked, and the air inside was stale and cold. Dust covered every surface, but the furniture, photographs, and even dishes on the table were eerily untouched, as if the family had left in the middle of dinner. We found a child's bedroom upstairs with toys scattered on the floor and a diary lying open on the bed. My dad skimmed through it, his face growing pale. The pages were filled with crude drawings of a tall, shadowy figure standing in various places around the house, outside windows, in the yard, even in the bedroom. The real horror began when we discovered the basement. The door was hidden behind a shelf in the kitchen. It creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading into pitch blackness. My dad insisted on going down, and I reluctantly followed. The basement walls were covered in photographs of families who had lived there before, each one dated and labeled, but something about the photos made my stomach drop. In the background of every picture was the same shadowy figure from the diary. In the center of the room stood a cracked mirror, covered in strange carved symbols. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive. As we approached it, I saw something move in the reflection. Something that wasn't us. Then we hearted the laughter, now deafening, echoing all around us. The basement door slammed shut, trapping us inside. My dad tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The laughter grew louder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist toward us. Desperate, I remembered the diary and how the child had written about the mirror being the bad man's home. I grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and smashed the mirror. The second it shattered, the laughter stopped and the oppressive air lifted. The door creaked open on its own, and we bolted out of the house without looking back. The next morning, my parents packed up everything and we left. They didn't care about the lease, they just wanted to get as far away as possible. A few weeks later, Mrs. Carlson called my mom to say a new family had moved into the house. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the shadowy figure in the photographs and the way it felt like something was watching us. And I wonder, is it still in that house, or did it follow us? If you ever find yourself looking at an abandoned house, thinking it might be fun to check it out, maybe it's better to leave it alone, because sometimes what's inside doesn't want to be found.